Hey, I'm Timothy, and today I'm walking you through some of the worst deaths I've ever come across. From a man who locked his professor inside a college conference room after failing a plagiarism appeal, to a street performer who took juggling machetes onto a live broadcast, only for it to end in a horrifying way. It was April 22, 2015, Mesa, Arizona, a community college campus on the east side of the city, a standard academic building with administrative offices, classrooms, and a conference room used for faculty meetings and student appeals. Nothing about the building or the day distinguished it from any other point in the semester. Phil Dawson was 24. He was enrolled part-time while working night shifts to cover his living expenses. He was behind on coursework and behind on bills. The two things fed into each other in a way that had been building for some time before the spring semester came to a head. Carol Reyes was 38. She had been teaching at the college for 9 years. She followed procedure. When Phil submitted his final paper and the plagiarism detection system returned a similarity score of approximately 74%, she reported it through the appropriate channels. That was her job, and she did it. A failing grade was issued. Academic probation was applied. Phil's financial aid eligibility was revoked as a direct result of the academic standing violation under the college's satisfactory academic progress policy. I understand that Phil has been under a lot of pressure. What I cannot get behind is what he did next. The consequences landed hard. He could no longer meet his rent obligations. His housing situation became unstable. His employer reduced his hours around the same period. The pressure was real, and it came from multiple directions at once. What Phil did with that pressure was direct it toward Carol Reyes. He did not frame what happened as a consequence of submitting work that was not his own. He framed it as something she had done to him personally. That distinction mattered in the weeks that followed. He began appearing on campus outside his scheduled hours. He attempted on more than one occasion to revisit the academic decision through informal channels, approaching staff and raising the matter in ways that fell outside normal procedure. He made clear in those interactions that he believed he had been targeted. The behavior was noted by at least one staff member, but was not formally logged or escalated. It did not at that point meet the threshold that would have triggered a referral to the college's behavioral intervention process, and no risk flag was placed on his file. Phil finally submitted a formal grade appeal. He requested that Carol Reyes be present at the meeting. The request was accommodated. A conference room was scheduled in the administrative wing. The room was an older facility, fitted with a privacy lock on the interior handle, a feature common in multi-use administrative buildings of that age and layout. 2 staff members were assigned to attend alongside Carol. The meeting began as a standard appeal review, limited in scope to the grade, the plagiarism finding, and the applicable policy. Nothing in the opening of the meeting deviated from normal procedure. At some point during the meeting, it became clear that a key piece of supporting documentation had not been pulled into the digital record and existed only in a physical file held in a separate office down the hall. Both staff members stepped out briefly to locate and retrieve it. The interval was brief. While they were outside the room, Phil Dawson engaged the privacy lock from the inside. Carol Reyes was alone with him in the room and could not leave. What followed was what no one saw coming. An altercation began when the discussion turned back to the grade and the plagiarism finding. Phil Dawson grabbed Carol Reyes and forced her head into the edge of the conference table. The impact was significant. He did it more than once, with enough force to cause severe head trauma. She lost consciousness and did not recover. She fell to the floor unconscious. When the staff members returned to the conference room, the door was locked and there was no response from inside. Campus security was contacted and forced entry was made. Phil Dawson was present and did not resist. Carol Reyes was found unresponsive on the floor. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing to be done. Carol Reyes was pronounced dead at the scene. Phil Dawson was detained without incident and subsequently charged with first-degree murder. In a statement, he indicated that he believed the academic consequences had been unjust. The college revised its meeting protocols and placed restrictions on closed-door proceedings conducted without continuous staff presence throughout the duration of any student appeal or disciplinary review. I wonder how it might have turned out if the staff hadn't stepped out, but there's no way to know. Something was wrong with the air that morning of March 7th, 2013, on the high-altitude trail along the border ridge of the southern Andes. Two members of the seven-person group had already noticed the barometer dropping faster than expected, and yet nobody said anything out loud. Rafael Ibarra and Sofia Lentz were both 38. They had met through a hiking club 11 years earlier. What the rest of the group had gathered within the first day on trail was that the two shared a long, complicated history of separations and reconciliations. The argument became visible around the 9-mile mark, not through raised voices, but through positioning. Rafael moving 10 paces ahead, Sofia responding by choosing a different line up a boulder section. The group leader, a Chilean national certified in mountain safety, paused the party twice, trying to keep both of them engaged in navigational decisions. It didn't hold. By the upper plateau, the two had drifted roughly 400 feet from the main party, moving parallel along the slope edge rather than the marked trail, though occasional terrain folds and rock spurs briefly broke direct line of sight between them and the main group. By early afternoon, the weather shifted hard. Temperature dropped approximately 14 degrees Fahrenheit in under an hour, and wind from the northwest began pushing blowing snow horizontally across the ridge. Visibility for the main group fell below 30 feet within 20 minutes. They stopped moving and established position near a rock outcrop on the leeward side of the slope. Rafael and Sofia were somewhere above them on the open face, well out of shouting range. A retired forestry worker had been positioned on a lower ridge approximately a half-mile south with binoculars, tracking the group's progress before the storm intensified. Through intermittent breaks in snowfall, he could make out only indistinct dark silhouettes rather than clear figures near the upper slope edge. The movement wasn't coordinated. One figure appeared to pause and turn while the other continued along the exposed edge. Then the first figure dropped, not cleanly. A sideways lean the body never corrected. The second figure angled toward the first, and then both were moving downslope in a way that wasn't walking, triggered by a sudden slip on a hidden patch of wind-packed ice that caused one to lose footing and the other to reach instinctively, pulling both off balance. The slope below that edge was approximately 45 to 50 degrees in steep mixed scree and broken rock, with short sections approaching roughly 55 degrees, descending toward a secondary ridge drop. The witness described the movement as irregular, not a tumble in the way people imagine it, but a staggered, accelerating sequence of partial recoveries that never completed. They passed below his sight line within 40 seconds. Snow closed back over the area within minutes. No other members of the main group saw the fall directly. The group leader contacted rescue coordination by radio at approximately 3:40 p.m. Weather conditions prevented any response until the following morning. Search teams reached both individuals roughly 11 hours after the call, both visibly deceased. Coroner documentation noted blunt force trauma consistent with uncontrolled descent across rocky alpine terrain, skull fractures, multiple rib fractures, and spinal injuries in both, with injury patterns suggesting multiple intermediate impacts before a final drop. I think about the group leader often when I go back through this one. There was a window somewhere in that afternoon where a different decision might have changed things, and I suspect he knows that too. No major press covered the recovery. Seasonal incident volume in the southern Andes that autumn meant the report was filed quietly and without ceremony. Two experienced people, more than a decade of difficult history, and a storm that moved faster than anyone predicted. That combination doesn't need embellishment. It explains itself. It was January 14th, 2018, Reno, Nevada. Not the Strip, not the casinos, just a quiet residential block with an aging 3-story brick apartment building. The kind of place where the hallways always smell like someone's cooking and the walls are thin enough to hear your neighbor's TV. Outside, it was 28 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping, and most people were already settled in for the night. Declan Forsyth worked as a line cook downtown, 9 hours on his feet in a hot kitchen on a Sunday. He was 27 and not the going out type on weeknights. He'd come home, eat something easy, crack open a beer, and decompress on the couch like clockwork. Two of his closest friends lived in the same building, same floor actually, and the three of them had a running history of pranking each other. Nothing serious, just the kind of dumb, low-effort stuff guys do when they've known each other too long and have too much time on their hands. Older buildings like this have a setup that not a lot of people know about. The breaker boxes aren't always inside the individual units. In a lot of these older builds, they're out in a shared hallway utility closet. And in this building, that closet was never locked, which in a building full of guys with too much time and too many beers is kind of a problem. By 9:30 that night, his two friends had been drinking since early afternoon and landed on the idea of flipping the breaker on Declan's unit. This was the plan. Kill the power. Wait for him to stumble into the hallway, confused and annoyed, get a laugh, flip it back on. Done. And so they did, and waited. A few minutes passed, but there was no reaction or noise from inside. They thought he'd already gone to bed or just didn't care enough to come out. So they went back to their unit and kept drinking, which at first sounded to me like a silly prank fail imaginable. Except they forgot one thing: they never flipped it back on. Just as they thought, Declan was already half asleep on the couch when the power cut. It barely registered. He fumbled around in the dark, found an old pillar candle on the kitchen counter, lit it, set it on the coffee table about a foot from the couch, and lay back down. He was out within minutes. His apartment was on the second floor, single entry with one door, no balcony. The windows were old crank style, painted over at the frames, the kind that take real effort to open even when you're fully alert. That matters because what happened next didn't give him any time to reach them. Somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight, the candle flame reached a stack of takeout menus and a dish towel sitting near the base of the coffee table. The couch was cheap synthetic upholstery, the kind that doesn't just burn. It off-gases almost immediately. Carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide build fast in a sealed space that size. At those concentrations, you're looking at unconsciousness in under 3 minutes. Declan was already deeply asleep. He never registered any of it. The fire burned itself out before morning, ran out of oxygen in the sealed apartment. Nobody in the building noticed anything that night. It wasn't until the next morning that a maintenance worker noticed dark staining around the bottom of the doorframe of Unit 2B. He knocked, but no answer. He opened it with his master key. The living room was gutted. Declan was still on the couch in the exact position he'd fallen asleep in. The power was still off. Declan was pronounced dead at the scene. There were no signs of struggle and no indication he ever woke up. Investigators quickly focused on the power outage. Both friends admitted to flipping the breaker as part of a prank, and phone records along with neighbor accounts confirmed the timeline. The breaker for Unit 2B was still in the off position when the scene was processed, supporting the sequence of events. They were formally charged with criminally negligent conduct resulting in death. The case centered on whether their actions directly created the conditions that led to the fire. The final outcome of the case was not publicly detailed.
It was June 9, 2014, on the grounds of a community park in East London, England, where a local television crew was present to film a segment on community fundraising. The fair had drawn several hundred attendees under a flat, overcast sky, the kind of day that photographs gray and forgettable until it doesn't. Vesta Cairn was 25 and enrolled part-time in a theater studies program at a performing arts college in central London. She had been volunteering with the same fundraising collective since she was 19. Arriving before setup crews, staying through breakdown, noting what needed improvement for the following year. In the months before the event, she completed a short acrobatics course at a community fitness center, part of a longer effort to add physical performance to a skill set that already included stage movement and improv. When a TV producer announced they will have a segment for this fair, she had not been assigned to the dunk tank. She had put her own name on the list. I get the sense of someone trying to expand what they can do, stepping a little further each time, and it makes the decision feel personal in a way that's hard to detach from. Vesta had a history of vasovagal syncope, which can cause sudden fainting from stress or overstimulation. She disclosed this weeks earlier, and organizers cleared her with a colleague nearby. Despite considering restrictions, they allowed her in the tank due to her experience. No harness was used, the platform was 4 feet high, and the tank held approximately 4 feet of water, and no additional broadcast safety review was conducted despite the presence of live cameras. The tank was positioned on a flat concrete apron near the park's eastern fence. Around it, the environment was relentless, foam balls striking the target plate, the crowd cycling through anticipation and reaction, a loudspeaker from the main stage about 60 yards away running announcements on a loop. The segment was already live on the broadcast feed. Cohen, the TV organizer, was at the base of the platform when he noticed Vesta shift her weight and press one hand flat against the support post beside her seat. He moved closer. A second volunteer was already positioned on the access step to her left. The crowd had peaked. The noise was the loudest it had been all morning. This moment reads to me like the last chance for intervention, a small signal that something might be off, almost lost in everything else happening around it. The countdown from the crowd reached 1. A ball hit the target plate, captured cleanly by the broadcast camera. The platform released, the fall unfolding on the live broadcast as Vesta tilted forward, not backward as the drop should produce, but forward, her torso already without tension before the seat gave way. The colleague on the access step reached for her arm and missed. Cohen later told investigators the motion was unlike a fall, more like a switch being cut than a person losing balance. There was no corrective response from her body. Her head struck the exposed concrete edge beside the tank on the descent. Contact was at the right temple. Multiple witnesses described a single sharp crack that cut through the ambient noise and stopped the crowd within seconds. Her body continued forward and entered the water. Cohen and the second volunteer immediately pulled Vesta from the tank onto the flat concrete apron. Cohen positioned her supine and cleared her airway while the second volunteer initiated chest compressions. She convulsed once, a brief, involuntary contraction, then went still. A bystander near the barrier called emergency services, while several others stood frozen as the nearby monitor that had been relaying the live feed went to a studio segment. Paramedics arrived in approximately 6 minutes. Resuscitation efforts continued at the scene before being discontinued. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as severe blunt cranial trauma from direct impact to the right temporal region against a hard concrete edge. Findings included a basilar skull fracture, acute subdural hemorrhage, and structural damage to the right temporal lobe. No drowning was identified. The water was not a contributing factor. The collective posted a brief statement online 2 days later. Fundraising continued through the remainder of the season with minimal social media coverage and no publicly shared photographs or video from that day. And the broadcaster confirmed that the live segment had been cut immediately and would not be rebroadcast or released. A gathering at her performing arts college drew close friends and a few faculty members. No public ceremony was held beyond that. I have said this on this channel before, but the part that doesn't leave me is the paperwork trail. The disclosure, the review, the monitoring arrangement. Every safeguard that was supposed to be present was present. It still wasn't enough. That is harder to sit with than negligence. It doesn't point anywhere.
It was May 14th, 2016, inside a regional gymnasium tucked into a quiet stretch of Ohio. The kind of facility that sits behind a strip mall, smells faintly of chalk dust and floor polish, and runs on the energy of a few dozen athletes chasing something bigger than the building itself. That afternoon, the gym was busier than usual. A local competition was coming up, and only one slot was still open. Whoever earned it would walk away with a meaningful cash prize and the kind of sponsorship exposure that could change a young athlete's trajectory. So every routine that week wasn't just practice, it was an audition. Lester Vray was 22 years old, a competitive gymnast who worked part-time as an assistant coach for the younger kids at the same gym. People who knew him described him as focused, quiet, and almost stubbornly consistent. He wasn't the flashiest athlete on the floor, but he rarely missed. And in the weeks leading up to selection, his routines had been the cleanest in the room. That made him the favorite, and it made Evan Sarto, a 23-year-old training at the same level who relied on competition winnings to pay his bills, very aware of where he stood. Earlier that day, Evan trained on the high bar and used a grip balm to manage hand strain. It's common in the sport, but if it isn't fully absorbed, it leaves a thin film on the bar. During his set, the bar didn't just feel slightly slick. It felt inconsistent, especially at the top of each swing where his hands briefly unweighted, forcing quick grip corrections. Chalk no longer spread evenly, leaving faint streaks where residue had built up. When he finished, he stood near the apparatus, knowing the right move was to wipe the bar down or flag it before anyone else got on. He didn't. Stopping the session would have reset the apparatus and given Lester a cleaner attempt later, so Evan walked away and said nothing. A short while later, Lester stepped up for his warm-up. On his first swing, he felt something off in the grip. He paused, re-chalked, tested another swing, and decided it felt manageable. The bar felt patchy, partially dry, partially slick, the kind of condition that builds after multiple athletes cycle through without cleaning. He thought about wiping the bar down, but he didn't want to break his rhythm. He trusted his hands. He went for the full routine. He coated both palms heavily, clapped once, and mounted the bar. The first swing felt uneven, but controllable. By the second, the heat and pressure of his grip were spreading a thin film across the bar, a mix of leftover oil, fresh chalk, and sweat. Each rotation made that layer more uniform and more slippery, noticeable if he had stopped, but easy to push through mid-routine. By the third swing, the friction had dropped enough that he was making small adjustments just to stay locked in. Heading into a release move on the next rotation, his lead hand shifted slightly early. He tried to correct mid-air. That correction dumped extra load onto his trailing hand, and at the peak of his rotation, that hand lost full contact with the bar. His hip clipped the bar on the way down, tilting his axis and dropping his trajectory. Instead of landing tall, he came down feet first with too much forward momentum. His knees buckled. The collapse traveled upward, his torso pitched forward, and his head struck the mat in a secondary impact. The force of that forward impact caused a catastrophic traumatic brain injury with cervical spine damage, leading to immediate loss of consciousness and ultimately his death. Other athletes climbed up to inspect the bar almost immediately. Several noted that it felt slick. Some admitted they had noticed the same inconsistent grip earlier but continued anyway. A quick check confirmed reduced surface friction from residue buildup. Multiple athletes had used the bar without cleaning it. No one had flagged it before Lester's turn. You know what really gets me about this? It wasn't some huge mistake or crazy stunt. It was just a bunch of little things people ignored. Lester was unresponsive when staff reached him. He was transported with severe trauma and never recovered. The apparatus was pulled from use that same evening, and the gym suspended selection while the incident was reviewed. The official findings pointed to compromised grip conditions as the primary contributing factor, combined with the decision to proceed after early warning signs. I feel bad for both of them, honestly. Evan probably thought it wasn't worth making a fuss, and Lester just wanted to keep his rhythm. But that's the pressure of competition. You're so focused on proving yourself that you push past warning signs. It makes you realize how much athletes risk just chasing their shot. It was February 17th, 2018. Savannah, Georgia in mid-February is that in-between kind of weather. Mild enough during the day, cooling down into the low 50s degrees Fahrenheit at night, the kind of conditions where people actually feel like going out. Willa Sombert was 71, born and raised in Savannah, spent 34 years teaching middle school English, and had been living alone in the same house since her husband passed a few years back. Sharp, independent, mild hypertension managed with medication. Nothing that would make anyone worry about her. That evening, her daughter and son-in-law took her out to a riverfront restaurant she'd always liked, just a quiet birthday dinner. She ordered the pan-seared flounder, something she'd had there before. Her daughter had been trying to get her out to that restaurant for weeks, and she'd kept putting it off the way she always did, saying it was too much trouble, that they didn't need to make a big deal out of it. That evening, she finally agreed. They had a good meal, talked, and her family dropped her home around 9 p.m. Nobody left that table with anything to worry about. The only thing she noticed, and barely registered, was a faint scratching sensation in her throat toward the end of the meal. She didn't mention it. It was her birthday. The evening had been good, and it felt like nothing worth bringing up. By the morning of February 18th, Willa had a dull ache behind her sternum that she treated with antacids. It eased slightly, which only confirmed in her mind it was reflux. She called her daughter, said she felt a bit off, probably just needed rest. By February 19th, the discomfort had worsened, and she'd developed a low-grade fever around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. She figured a cold was coming on and stayed home. And honestly, who wouldn't do the same? Every symptom she had at that point had a completely routine explanation. By the evening the next day, the fever had pushed past 102 degrees Fahrenheit. The chest pain had gotten bad enough that taking a full breath hurt, and she was having difficulty swallowing even water. She called her daughter just before midnight. Here's what had actually been happening inside her chest over those 3 days. The mediastinum, the enclosed space in the center of the chest between the two lungs, had been filling with infection the entire time she was home, treating what she thought was a cold. It's one of the worst places in the body for that to happen, spreading fast through a confined space that sits right up against structures you cannot afford to lose. By the time she made that call, it had likely been going on for close to 2 days already. Given her age and how far the infection had progressed, surgery carried more risk than benefit. Aggressive antibiotic treatment was started immediately, but her condition kept declining through February 21st. The infection spreading faster than treatment could contain it. Septic shock set in as her cardiovascular system lost the ability to keep up. Sadly, Willa died on February 22nd, 5 days after her birthday dinner. Post-mortem confirmed septic shock secondary to mediastinitis from esophageal perforation. A fishbone fragment measuring approximately 14 millimeters was recovered from the perforation site. Contributing factors included her age, the thinning of esophageal tissue, and the delay in seeking care. The restaurant was reviewed and came back clean. The bone was a naturally occurring fragment in the fillet, undetected during preparation. The case was ruled accidental. It was October 28, 2017. Athens, Georgia, a college town on a Saturday night, Halloween weekend, which means everyone was already a little more wound up than usual. Off-campus rental, maybe 30 people packed into a space that comfortably fit half that. Loud, crowded conversations happening in shouts. Ronan Strand was the kind of guy who got along with everyone and never really said no to anything. 20 years old, sophomore, communications major. He'd been at the party a couple of hours with 6 friends he'd known since freshman year. Just another Saturday night for him. One of them was a guy named Callum. He had come to the party with something already in mind. He'd read about the Nutmeg High weeks earlier, thought it was funny, and had been waiting for the right night. He brought a container of ground nutmeg in his jacket pocket. Large dose, legal, supposed to cause hallucinations. He thought it would make for a good story. He didn't look much further into it than that. He brought it up around 11 p.m., casual, like it just occurred to him. Pulled out the container, explained the concept, made it sound like something people did. He aimed it at Ronan specifically. Easygoing, always up for something. The last person in the group to back down in front of people. It's obvious Ronan was the easiest target in the room, and Callum knew it. By the time it became a dare, it already had an audience. Ronan grabbed the container, tipped a heaping amount into his palm, somewhere around 2 to 3 tablespoons, and washed it down with whatever was in his cup. Everyone laughed. Callum filmed it. They moved on. What most people don't know is what nutmeg actually does at that dose. The active compound is myristicin, and at high enough concentrations, it triggers a toxic syndrome, rapid heart rate, severe nausea, disorientation, hyperthermia, and in serious cases, seizures and organ stress. Onset takes 1 to 3 hours, which is exactly why nobody made the connection when Ronan started feeling off later that night. His friends figured he was drunk. He sat down, drank some water, tried to shake it off. He vomited twice, came back from the bathroom pale and disoriented, still talking, still responding, but something was clearly not right. His friends put him in a bedroom to sleep it off. The nutmeg was hours ago. Everyone had moved on. A friend checked on him around 1 a.m., sweating heavily, breathing fast, skin flushed and hot to the touch, still responsive but barely making sense. Another 30 minutes passed before anyone called for help. Genuine uncertainty about whether this was just alcohol or something worse. Responders arrived 11 minutes after the call. By the time he reached a medical facility, Ronan was in and out of consciousness. Heart rate dangerously elevated, temperature at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Liver values already abnormal on initial blood work. The alcohol already in his system had compounded the toxic response. Myristicin metabolism is processed through the same hepatic pathways as alcohol, placing additional strain on the liver simultaneously. A seizure occurred during treatment. His heart couldn't sustain the combined stress of the hyperthermia, the seizure activity, and the organ strain. Ronan Strand died approximately 9 hours after arriving at the facility. He was 20 years old. Cause of death was acute nutmeg toxicity, myristicin-induced hyperthermia, seizure activity, and cardiac arrest secondary to multi-organ stress. Toxicology confirmed myristicin concentration consistent with the ingested amount. The combination with alcohol was noted as a significant contributing factor, ruled accidental. No charges were filed against anyone. Callum had planned the whole thing, picked the target, brought the nutmeg, and filmed it. None of that was enough to constitute a criminal act under Georgia law. There was no statute directly applicable to providing a legal substance that resulted in unintended death without demonstrated knowledge of lethal risk. The video of Ronan laughing as he washed it down was recovered from Callum's phone during the investigation. He was interviewed twice. He was never charged. It was May 3rd, 2019, Houston, Texas, a private residence on the west side of the city. The evening function was scheduled to begin at 7. The kitchen was domestic, the counter space limited, and no allergen handling controls had been established for the evening. Tools and surfaces were shared between dishes and between staff, creating a risk of cross-contamination. Ethan Cole was 33. He had spent 6 years working in a Houston restaurant owned by a man named Victor Alvarez. He was the first employee Victor ever hired. In the early period, when the restaurant had not yet found its footing and the margins were thin, Ethan was there. He learned the kitchen under Victor, followed his standards, and stayed through the difficult stretch when a lot of people would have left. Victor trusted him during that time in ways he did not trust many people. The break came during year 6. A health code issue surfaced inside the restaurant. The details of the violation were documented and known to both men. Victor wanted it handled quietly. Ethan refused. What followed moved quickly. Victor accused Ethan of theft shortly after. The accusation was never substantiated in any formal proceeding, but it did not need to be. It circulated. Houston's catering and food industry was connected enough that the name spread before Ethan had a chance to respond to it. Work dried up. He lost his position. He lost the professional standing he had spent 6 years building. I have to be honest. The accusation doing its damage without ever being proven is the part of this that sits badly with me. At the time of the May 2019 event, Ethan's wife was undergoing cancer treatment. The costs were ongoing and significant. The termination and the accusation had pushed the household into financial collapse. They lost their housing. Ethan had spent the period between his dismissal and the spring of 2019 rebuilding slowly through freelance catering contracts, taking whatever work came through contacts who did not always vet him closely or ask about his history. That is how he came to be in Victor Alvarez's kitchen on the evening of May 3rd. Victor had contracted the function through a private events company. The company sourced staff through their own network. Ethan had worked several prior engagements through that same company and had established enough of a record with them that he was given lead cook responsibilities when available. For the May 3rd event, he was assigned that role. In that capacity, he held direct responsibility for menu execution, station assignments, and food preparation from start to finish. The company never knew both Ethan and Victor had any past relationship. Victor had a severe shellfish allergy. It was not a minor sensitivity. The allergy was documented and widely known among people who had worked with him or been around him socially. He carried an epinephrine injector. He had made the allergy known to staff at his own restaurant for years. It was the kind of detail that people in his circle did not need to be told twice. Ethan had worked in that circle for 6 years. The evening menu included a shellfish appetizer. As lead cook, Ethan held direct responsibility for that menu. He prepared the shellfish course himself. The dish was plated under his supervision and moved to service with the rest of the first course. The kitchen was busy, and the other staff were directed through their stations by Ethan throughout the evening. Preparation tasks ran across shared surfaces and overlapping work lines. Victor consumed the appetizer at his own table, in his own home, unaware that it had been exposed to shellfish. Within minutes, the symptoms began. Initial accounts from those present suggested the reaction was not immediately recognized for what it was. His breathing changed and his throat tightened before the severity became apparent to the people around him. An epinephrine injector was present on site, but the severity of the reaction was not recognized in time for it to be administered before loss of airway control. The reaction escalated into full anaphylaxis before emergency services could be reached and respond. Paramedics arrived on scene. There was nothing to be done. Victor was pronounced dead that evening. The cause of death was anaphylaxis consistent with acute shellfish exposure. Investigators were unable to recover uncontaminated food samples for definitive testing, and no conclusive forensic link was established between a specific preparation step and the point of exposure. The prior relationship between Ethan Cole and the victim was identified through employment records and confirmed through multiple industry contacts. As lead cook, Ethan held documented responsibility for the evening's menu and its execution. The case was referred for prosecutorial review. Charges were filed at a later stage. Ethan Cole was identified as the primary person of interest and subsequently taken into custody. His wife remained in active cancer treatment at the time of his arrest. I am not in a position to say what Ethan Cole did or did not do in that kitchen, but I can tell you that none of them deserves what they got.
It was December 23, 2015, in a paved public square in central Cairo, Egypt. The afternoon sun flat and pale gold, the air carrying exhaust and roasted nuts, and where a man who had spent nearly a decade perfecting his craft bled out on a concrete stage in front of a live crowd in under 2 minutes. Radi Mansour was 31 years old and had worked as a street performer in Cairo since his early 20s, building a quiet but reliable reputation in the tourist corridors near the city's most visited landmarks. He specialized in bladed juggling, knives, cleavers, and most prominently, machetes, and had spent years refining a routine built around precise arc throws and timed catch sequences. I keep thinking how this isn't some reckless beginner. This is someone who practiced every day, which somehow makes what's coming feel worse. Local vendors who watched him regularly described him as obsessively consistent. He ran his full routine every morning before tourists arrived, adjusting spacing and timing until each pass was repeatable to the inch. He had performed at street festivals, private events, and cultural exhibitions across the city. What he had never done was perform under live broadcast conditions. 3 weeks before December 23rd, a regional production crew approached him about a short live segment for a local station's holiday coverage. The arrangement was simple: perform his standard routine, draw a crowd. One detail changed in the final production meeting. The low rope barrier he used to keep bystanders at a safe distance was not removed, but was instead repositioned about 6 feet back and slightly lowered to improve camera sightlines, which slightly reduced the protective space around him. The square that afternoon held roughly 60 tourists and local pedestrians in a loose semicircle around the performance area. A 40-foot stretch of uneven concrete slightly sloped toward a center drain. The surface had been patched several times over the years, and a raised seam ran across the stone roughly 4 feet from where Roddy typically planted his left foot during catch sequences. The routine started cleanly with the main broadcast camera fixed on him. Witnesses described the first several passes as controlled and precise. On the 4th sequence, Roddy shifted slightly to his right. His left heel caught the concrete seam, a minor slip that displaced him only an inch or two from his normal stance. The machete left his right hand on its upward arc. This small stance change altered the blade's trajectory enough that it came back lower and closer than he expected. Roddy extended his left arm to correct. His right hand crossed to intercept. The crew shouted from behind the camera cluster. He did not have time to redirect. I'm literally watching this like it's in slow motion, knowing it's just inches and seconds, deciding everything is honestly terrifying. The blade struck the right side of his neck at the base, just above the clavicle, the moment visible on the live broadcast for several seconds before the feed cut. It opened a deep wound approximately 4 inches across the side of the neck, severing the right external jugular vein and lacerating the right common carotid artery. He dropped straight to the pavement. No stagger, no catch. Blood reached the concrete in volume within seconds and spread across the uneven surface faster than anyone around him could process. It's so direct and clinical, but that almost makes it worse for me because there's no drama, just instant reality. A witness named Samir, standing near the front of the crowd, moved first. He pushed through the bystanders and pressed both hands against the wound. Tourists pulled back, several screaming. The production crew cut the live feed within approximately 20 seconds of the fall. Samir held pressure while someone called for an ambulance. A crew member placed the emergency call. Responders arrived 9 minutes later. He was transported to a regional medical facility and pronounced dead on arrival. The coroner's finding, in plain terms, acute hemorrhagic shock caused by laceration of the right carotid artery and jugular vein. Given the severity and location of the wound, there was no viable intervention window. Death resulted directly from exsanguination. The local station issued a brief line noting a performance accident. No extended coverage followed. Samir gave one account to investigators and declined to speak further. Roddy's family held a private funeral attended only by close relatives and a small number of fellow performers. Multiple tourists had recorded portions of the incident on their phones, but most footage remained private or unshared outside immediate circles. The production crew issued no public statement.
It was August 3, 2013. Hargrove County, Alabama. Small, rural. The kind of place where the roads turn to gravel before you even realize you've left the main highway. The trailer park sat about 2 miles off the road, maybe 40 units crammed into a flat, dusty lot with chain link fencing around the edges. It was a Saturday afternoon, 94 degrees Fahrenheit, and nobody was going anywhere. The guy in the single wide at the back of the lot was named Mervyn Speck, 44, quiet, and had been out of work since early spring. He's behind on rent, behind on everything really, and that kind of pressure had just been sitting on him for months. People who knew him said he was mostly quiet, but didn't take well to being pushed. He'd been living alone in a single wide at the back of the lot for close to 6 years. 1 unit over was Cody Rains, 26, never without his phone out, always looking for a reaction and way too confident with his own humor. He and Mervyn weren't close, but they knew each other the way you know someone when you've shared a fence line long enough. So Cody gets his hands on a fake scratch-off lottery ticket. Not just any fake, the kind you can actually order online that's designed to look exactly like a real one, printed to read as a $500,000 winner when scratched. And he decides the move is to hand it to Mervyn, finds him outside that afternoon, tells him he found it near the front office and figured he could use the luck. Casual, no big setup, just hands it over. Mervyn scratches it right there, and it reads as a winner. I mean, $500,000. This is a man who can't make rent, hasn't had a real paycheck in 7 months. And for about 30 seconds, he's holding what looks like the answer to every single problem he has. His hands were shaking. He read it again. Cody was already trying not to laugh. Then he told him it was fake. Phone already out, already recording, laughing right in his face. That's not a prank at that point, that's just mean. Mervyn didn't react the way Cody expected at all. His expression just emptied out, not angry, not upset, just gone. He looked at the ticket, then at Cody, set the ticket down on the step beside him, and walked inside without a word. And Cody, he kept filming and laughing like he just did the funniest thing ever. Neighbors who'd been watching drifted off. Everyone figured that was the end of it. Mervyn came back out less than 2 minutes later. He walked straight at Cody. Cody still had his phone up, still smiling. It went from 0 to over in about 3 seconds. He pulled a folding knife and drove it straight into Cody's upper abdomen. Cody dropped. Mervyn let the knife fall right there, walked back to his trailer, and went inside. A woman 2 units over called for help immediately. Responders took about 16 minutes since the nearest station was far out and the gravel road slowed things down. By the time they got there, Cody was already unconscious. A stab wound to the hepatic artery bleeds fast. We're talking minutes before the pressure drops too far to recover from. Cody was pronounced dead at the scene. Single stab wound to the upper abdomen, hepatic artery laceration, rapid internal hemorrhage. Gone before anyone could do anything about it. Mervyn was still inside his trailer when responders arrived, didn't resist. The knife was right where he'd dropped it. Cody's phone was recovered from the ground. It had captured the entire confrontation on video, start to finish. The fake lottery ticket was sitting on the step where Mervyn had left it. The case was ruled a homicide, and Mervyn was charged with second-degree murder. The prosecution relied primarily on the recorded footage and his admission at the scene. The phone footage was entered as the primary evidence. Honestly, there wasn't much else needed. The whole thing was right there on the screen. It was September 3rd, 2015, at a private training facility off a service road in Colorado. The kind of place that doesn't show up on a map unless you already know it exists. Converted from an old equipment warehouse, high ceilings, foam pits in one corner, a single high bar setup near the back wall. The athletes who trained there had keys. That detail matters. The facility was quiet that evening. Most of the staff had gone home. The lights in the back half were on a manual switch and only one car was left in the lot. Kevin Blant was 19 years old, a junior national-level gymnast who'd been training at that facility since he was a kid. By his late teens, he'd built a reputation for 2 things: an obsessive work ethic and a preference for training alone. Coaches said he didn't like being watched on bad reps. He'd rather drill in private until something clicked, then show up the next day looking like he'd never struggled with it. He was also known for asking staff to set the high bar cables at slightly looser tension than standard. Looser cables give you more flex, more amplitude on a giant swing, and more stress on the apparatus every rotation. Earlier that week, other athletes had mentioned a creaking sound coming from the right side of the high bar. A few of them flagged it casually. Kevin had heard it too. He just didn't think it meant anything. The thing that gets me about Kevin is that he wasn't reckless in the way people imagine. He was the opposite. He was disciplined to the point that it became the problem. That night, he came back after hours. No coach, no spotter, no one watching. He turned on the backlights, chalked up, and started working through giants, the long, full-body rotations around the bar that demand precise grip timing every pass. Investigators later pieced together the sequence from the state of the apparatus, the chalk pattern on the bar, and Kevin's own training log, which he'd filled out before stepping onto the floor. He started his set. The first 2 giants went clean. On the 3rd rotation, the right cable, the one the other athletes had been hearing, failed internally. Not a clean snap, a partial failure where the inner strands give out before the outer sheath does. This caused the right upright to lose tension, letting that side dip several inches and tilting the bar mid-swing. Most athletes would stop there, reset, step off, check the rig. Kevin went into the 4th swing. That's when the cable failed completely. The remaining strands gave way. The right support line slackened and the bar dropped sharply on one side, pulling the structure off balance and collapsing the right upright inward. Because his hands were still locked in at the top of the rotation, his body got pulled down with the collapsing side. His swing radius shortened instantly. His hips dropped below where they should have been. He released early. At reduced height, with no clean line to the mat, he came down heavy on his side, rib cage and shoulder absorbing most of the impact before his head struck the mat at an angle. As he hit, part of the destabilized bar assembly and cable dropped onto him, pinning his upper body. He was alone for a long time before anyone found him. A staff member arrived the next morning to open up and saw the lights on in the back. Kevin was still beneath the partially collapsed structure. Emergency services transported him in critical condition, but the injuries, severe chest trauma combined with a traumatic brain injury, were unsurvivable, and he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The investigation focused on the apparatus first. Inspectors confirmed progressive cable fatigue on the right side, consistent with weeks of cumulative stress under looser-than-standard tension settings. The internal strands had been failing gradually. The creaking the other athletes had heard wasn't flex, it was a warning. And honestly, what stays with me isn't the cable. It's the choice to be alone. If even one other person had been in that building, the outcome might have looked completely different. The facility was closed for 2 weeks. Maintenance reporting procedures were rewritten. Any unusual sound from an apparatus now required a formal write-up before the next session. 6-story residential apartment block in Seville's Triana district had stood like any other on its narrow street. Unremarkable, dependable, filled with ordinary routines. But that morning of November 3rd, 2014, before the city properly woke, something had already gone wrong deep inside its lower corridor. Mateo and Clara Vela were both in their mid-40s and had lived on the 3rd floor of that building for over 16 years. Mateo taught history at a local secondary school and was known among colleagues for arriving early and grading papers through lunch. Clara handled administration at a small family printing business. Their adult children, a son and a daughter, both living outside Seville, described them to investigators in nearly identical terms: inseparable, routine-driven, the kind of couple who had the same Sunday conversation every week. Neighbors knew them by Clara's coffee and Mateo's radio on every weekday morning at 6. The gas leak had been building for hours in the building's lower maintenance corridor, a corroded supply line running beneath the ground floor. At least 3 residents reported a faint sulfurous odor as early as 4 a.m. One knocked on a neighbor's door. Another cracked a window and went back to sleep. No one called the building's utility emergency line. No evacuation was ordered. I find that infuriating, not because people are careless by nature, but because no system told them clearly enough what to do. Gas accumulates in unventilated spaces the way water fills a bowl, slowly, then all at once. The building's boiler was scheduled to begin a preheating cycle at 6:10 a.m. The electrical ignition component activated on schedule. By then, the gas concentration in the lower corridor had already crossed the combustion threshold. A shopkeeper across the street had just unlocked his storefront and was stepping back inside when the explosion occurred. He told investigators the sound was not a crack or a bang, but a deep physical compression, as though the air around the building briefly collapsed inward due to the pressure wave before rebounding outward in the explosion front. Security footage from his shop captured a lateral blast from the building's midsection, debris spreading outward at street level, followed immediately by partial structural collapse on the left side. The footage shows window glass disappearing inward a half-second before the outer wall buckles and drops. Residents above described the floor tilting before they understood what was happening. One man on the 4th floor was thrown against a door frame and broke his collarbone. A woman on the second floor fell through a partially collapsed ceiling section into the hallway below, sustaining fractures to both legs. The right side of the building largely held. The left did not. The difference between the right unit and the left unit on the third floor was the difference between walking out and not walking out at all. The shopkeeper called emergency services at 6:13 a.m. Fire and rescue units arrived within 11 minutes. Recovery teams worked through the debris in layered sections. Mateo and Clara were found beneath approximately 4 feet of collapsed flooring and ceiling material, close together, in what remained of their bedroom. Physical evidence indicated they were in bed when the structure came down. Passive compression injuries, caused by weight rather than direct impact, indicated neither had moved after the initial collapse. The medical examiner listed cause of death for both as compressive asphyxia with blunt thoracic and cranial trauma consistent with structural collapse. No burn injuries were found on either body. Their children arrived the following day. A joint funeral was held 4 days later at a church 3 streets from the apartment. The son gave a brief statement to the local press. The daughter did not speak publicly. Neither returned to the site. The building was condemned and later demolished. What sucks about this story is it started with a smell 3 separate people noticed before dawn. And the only decision that could have changed anything was the one nobody made before 6 in the morning. It was June 3rd, 2017. Pilsen, on Chicago's Lower West Side, is the kind of neighborhood that feels genuinely lived in. Dense blocks, specialty markets, storefronts that have been there for decades, serving a largely immigrant community that built the place up. In early June, the weather finally turns, windows open, people out on the street, the whole neighborhood running at full volume. Kaylee Thoan was 31. She'd grown up in the Chicago area, daughter of Vietnamese immigrants, and worked as a dental hygienist on the North Side. Social, close with a tight group of people, and genuinely into cooking, the kind of food she'd grown up eating at home specifically. That evening, she was at a casual dinner at a friend's second-floor walk-up, 5 people around a small table with the windows open, nobody checking the time. The kind of dinner where the food is the whole point. The host had picked up freshwater crab that morning from a specialty import market a few blocks away and spent most of the day making a traditional Vietnamese crab soup the way her family always had. Kaylee ate a full portion without hesitation. She'd grown up eating dishes like this her whole life. I mean, we all have that one thing we grew up eating that we'd never in a million years think could hurt us, right? Freshwater crab is the base of bun rio, a slow-cooked soup built around crab paste and tomato that takes most of the day to develop. The crab is processed by hand, the paste worked into the broth over low heat, the kind of dish you make when the occasion means something. What wasn't known that evening was that the batch from the import market had never been inspected and the crab hadn't reached the internal temperatures needed to kill parasitic larvae. It looked right, smelled right, tasted exactly like what Kaylee had eaten her whole life. There was no way to know. Kaylee felt completely fine for the first several days after the dinner. By June 9th, she started getting intermittent sharp pains along her lower back and left leg. She figured she'd pulled something at work, maybe from the repetitive positioning that comes with leaning over patients all day. By June 14th, the pain had gotten significantly worse, and she'd developed noticeable weakness in her left leg. A general practitioner suspected a herniated disc and recommended rest and anti-inflammatories, which made complete sense given her job. By June 17th, she'd lost most motor function in her left leg and was having severe headaches. She was admitted that evening. Imaging told a completely different story. Hemorrhagic lesions along her spinal cord, early intracranial involvement. Something had entered the spinal canal and was migrating upward toward the brainstem. Gnathostoma larvae in the central nervous system don't settle somewhere and stay put. They keep moving through tissue continuously, leaving bleeding tracks along every path they cut through. That's what hemorrhagic meningitis looks like in this context. By June 18th, Kaylee had lost all motor function below the waist. By June 20th, the bleeding had reached the brainstem. She lost consciousness that afternoon and never came back from it. Kaylee died the next day, 18 days after that dinner. Cause of death was confirmed as hemorrhagic meningoencephalitis, secondary to cerebral nathostomiasis. Post-mortem identified larval migration tracts throughout the spinal cord and brainstem tissue. The freshwater crab was traced to the import market and back to a Southeast Asian supplier. Larvae were identified in a remaining portion of the same batch. The other 4 people at that dinner either ate smaller portions or had theirs more thoroughly cooked, and none of them developed symptoms. The import market was flagged for sourcing uninspected freshwater crustacean product. The case was ruled accidental. It was January 28, 2018, at a local competition hall in Illinois. A first-round qualifying meet, the kind of event smaller programs use as a soft entry point for new competitors. The hall was a multi-purpose space rented out for the weekend, a community center with retractable bleachers on one side, fluorescent overhead lighting, and a competition floor laid in that morning. The hall hadn't been designed for gymnastics. The beam sat 4 feet from the front row, and the mat coverage didn't quite reach the spectator side. A narrow strip of bare floor ran between the edge of the mat and the chairs. All day, spectators had been leaning over it. Vita Splint was 18 years old in her first competitive season after a long stretch of training-only years. She'd taken a part-time job at a local clothing store to pay for her meet fees, and her family had driven in to watch her first official competition. Coaches described her as precise, quiet, and unusually disciplined for a first-year competitor. The kind of athlete who built routines around clean execution rather than maximum difficulty. Her beam routine was known for narrow margins, tight turns, controlled balance work, no big throwaway elements. During warm-ups, she'd had a couple of small balance corrections, nothing dramatic, but more wobble than her coaches usually saw. The conditions weren't ideal. The beam felt slightly cooler than the studio she trained in, and the proximity of the audience meant the room sounded different from anything she'd practiced in. Coaches discussed simplifying her routine, swapping out the harder turn for a lower difficulty version. Vita said no. Her family had driven hours to watch this. Her teammates were waiting on her score for the team total. She'd trained the harder version for months, and downgrading on the floor felt, to her, like losing before she'd started. If I were in her shoes, I know I'd feel the same. There's something about having your family in the crowd, the people who sacrificed, encouraged, and believed in you, that makes you want to give everything you've got. Her event came up. She mounted the beam, moved through the opening sequence cleanly, and reached the toe turn, a controlled rotation on the ball of 1 foot, the element she'd trained the hardest version of. She entered the turn slightly off-center. Not dramatically, but enough that she needed to make a small correction mid-rotation. Witnesses in the side rows said they saw her shift her hips to recover. Mid-correction, a spectator in the front row shouted. Not at her, at someone else, 2 seats down, a comment about the routine. Loud, close, sudden. The sound landed at the exact moment Vita's body was making the adjustment. Her timing on the recovery slipped by a fraction. Her foot lost contact with the beam laterally, not a clean slip down the side, but a sideways shear off the surface. Her body pivoted around the beam itself instead of dropping straight off it. Her hips struck the mat edge first, redirecting her momentum away from the padded zone and into the narrow, uncovered gap on the spectator side. She continued rotating through the fall, and her final contact was on the bare floor beyond the mat boundary. Officials halted the event within seconds. The spectator who'd shouted was identified and removed. Medical staff reached Vita quickly. She was initially conscious, talking to the responders, but deteriorated during on-site assessment and was transported under critical care. The detail that gets to me is the gap, 4 feet between the apparatus and the audience, and a strip of uncovered floor in between. Somebody made a layout decision that morning, and it held until the worst possible moment. The investigation produced 2 findings. The first identified inadequate mat coverage on the spectator side was the direct mechanical contributor to the fatal impact. The second cited insufficient audience boundary management, including the lack of a buffer zone between the front row and the apparatus. In the months that followed, Vita's family stayed involved in the process that reviewed the venue's setup and safety procedures. They pushed for clearer standards around mat coverage and audience distance, not just for that facility, but across similar local meets that often operate in repurposed spaces. It was June 14, 2017, Surrey, England, a residential property belonging to the Calloway family. The garden was landscaped and maintained, with a small culinary herb section along the south-facing border. No labeling system had been put in place and no separation existed between the plants growing there. Arthur Bennett was 63. He worked part-time as a gardener, quiet by nature and reliable in his habits. He had not always lived that way. Some years before, his wife and daughter were killed in a road traffic collision. They had been traveling together to collect his daughter's wedding gown ahead of her upcoming marriage. The driver was Joshua Calloway, 29. He was known locally for reckless behavior behind the wheel and had accumulated a prior record that reflected it. The case was prosecuted, but the Calloway family had money and connections that reached into the local legal and civic structure, and those connections were used. The case concluded with an outcome that bore little relationship to what had been lost. Arthur did not make public statements. He withdrew from most of his previous social life and took on low-profile work. He was hired by the Calloways some time later. He did not identify himself to them or disclose any connection to the case when he accepted the position. The family had not appeared in court during the proceedings in any meaningful capacity. They had managed the situation from a distance. Through representatives and relationships, Arthur's name would have meant nothing to them. He arrived at the property, kept his head down, and worked. He remained in the role for just over 2 years and became an unremarkable presence on the grounds. He raised no grievances. He drew no attention. At the homeowner's request, he established a small herb bed along the south border, incorporating parsley, coriander, and several other common culinary plants. The family took to using the herb bed regularly. They harvested from it for their own cooking, incorporating it into their household routine with some frequency. It was during this period, after the family had established a clear and consistent pattern of harvesting directly from the garden, that a plant later identified as poison hemlock became established within the bed. It didn't stand out. It blended in closely enough with the other herbs to be missed, especially by someone harvesting quickly. It wasn't labeled, it wasn't separated, and Arthur Bennett left it that way before he walked away from the job. Arthur Bennett left the position in the months before June 2017. He cited worsening pain in his knees as the reason for stepping back from the work. He was not present at the property on the date of the incident. By June 2017, the herb bed was in full seasonal growth. The household had developed a routine of harvesting directly from the garden as needed for cooking. On the morning of June 14th, Joshua's mother went out to the herb bed and cut a handful of leaves from the parsley section to use in a lunch she was preparing. There was no immediately obvious difference to someone harvesting quickly, especially with the plants growing closely together. The material was incorporated into the meal during normal preparation in a quantity sufficient to cause toxicity. Nothing about the dish appeared unusual before it was served and eaten. Joshua Calloway was home that day and ate the meal. Symptoms developed within approximately an hour, consistent with reported onset ranges for coneine exposure. What began as numbness around the mouth moved into the limbs. Breathing became labored. The body's ability to regulate its own muscular response broke down progressively and without reversal. Emergency services were contacted. Joshua Calloway was unresponsive by the time paramedics arrived. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Death resulted from respiratory failure caused by coneine toxicity. Examination of the herb bed confirmed the presence of Conium maculatum growing intermixed with culinary herbs in the parsley section. Investigators reviewed the full history of the garden's maintenance and identified Arthur Bennett as the person responsible for its establishment and ongoing care. His background was examined. The case was classified as a fatal toxic plant ingestion resulting from misidentified herb use in a domestic garden. No criminal charges were filed. I've sat with Arthur Bennett case longer than the others. I won't say what I think he did, but the hemlock was in the parsley, and he knew they would harvest it.
It was October 19, 2014. The flight had taken off from a mid-sized regional airport in Ohio, bound for Charlotte, North Carolina, a routine commuter route, maybe an hour and 20 minutes in the air on a good day. The plane was full, or close to it, window seats taken, middle seats taken. The kind of flight where you're basically shoulder to shoulder with a stranger for the whole thing. It was a Monday morning. Vivian Harmon was 63, retired school teacher, 31 years in the classroom before she finally called it. She was flying alone to visit her daughter and 2 grandkids, a trip she'd been looking forward to for weeks. She had a known heart condition, had been managing it with medication for about 4 years, and had a pacemaker fitted the previous spring. She wasn't in poor health by any means. She was rather active. She traveled and managed it well. Now, October 2014. If you remember what that month felt like, Ebola was everywhere. Every headline, every news ticker, every conversation. The first case on U.S. soil had been confirmed just weeks earlier, and the public fear around it was genuinely out of control. People were scared in a way that wasn't entirely rational, but also wasn't entirely without reason. It was the kind of climate where just hearing the word in the wrong context made people's skin crawl. The flight had been in the air for about 40 minutes, cruising altitude, everything normal. Vivian was in a window seat toward the middle of the cabin. She wasn't a nervous flyer exactly, but she wasn't entirely comfortable either. She'd mentioned to her daughter before boarding that smaller commuter planes always made her a little anxious. She had her book open. She was managing fine. A 24-year-old man seated a few rows ahead, traveling alone, had been restless and loud since before takeoff, the kind of passenger flight attendants clock immediately, stood up from his seat mid-flight for no apparent reason. A few people looked over. Then he announced, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, that he'd just returned from West Africa and wasn't feeling well, that he thought he might have Ebola. In that cabin, in that climate, saying that out loud was like pulling a pin. The cabin went from quiet to chaos in about 10 seconds. People were standing, some pushing toward the back, voices overlapping, a few people crying. Flight attendants were trying to get everyone seated and couldn't. The pilot came over the intercom almost immediately, but the cabin was already gone by then. Witnesses described the noise as overwhelming, the kind of panic that feeds itself once it starts. Vivian's seatmate said she grabbed his arm the moment the man stood up. By the time the shouting started, she had gone pale and was pressing her hand flat against her chest. He asked if she was okay. She didn't respond. Within about 90 seconds of the outburst, she was unresponsive, head back against the seat, completely still. Her pacemaker data later confirmed a sudden cardiac event at almost the exact minute the disruption began. The stress response had triggered an acute myocardial infarction, and her heart couldn't sustain it. It's worth knowing that emotional and psychological shock can absolutely cause a fatal cardiac event in someone with a compromised cardiovascular system. It's documented, it's real, and it doesn't take much when the heart is already working around a weakness. The pilot diverted and declared an emergency. They were on the ground roughly 20 minutes later at the nearest suitable airport. The man who caused the panic had no illness at all, not Ebola, not anything. He was detained on the tarmac immediately. Responders reached Vivian within minutes of landing, but there was nothing to be done. She had been unresponsive for most of the descent. Vivian Harmon was pronounced dead shortly after landing. The cause was an acute myocardial infarction triggered by sudden psychological stress, with pacemaker data placing the event within seconds of the disruption and confirming her seatmate's account. The 24-year-old was charged with criminal negligence resulting in death and public endangerment. He stated he believed it would be taken as a joke and did not expect the reaction it caused. The flight manifest, crew statements, and recorded data formed the core of the case. He was later convicted and sentenced to several years in prison, with the court citing the panic he caused as a direct contributing factor in the death. It was July 21, 2017, at a Texas sports hall. A summer showcase was held in a multi-use facility where industrial ceiling fans were running to compensate for a struggling AC system. One of these fans, mounted directly above the tumbling lane, had been flagged for loose bolts and a vibrating bracket days prior, but the necessary repairs were never completed and the fan remained in use. One of those fans, mounted directly above the tumbling lane, had been flagged days earlier. The bolts holding the bracket had loosened. Staff tightened it once as a temporary fix, but the vibration returned. A repair order had been written. It hadn't been completed. The fan stayed active. Maddie Trove was 24, a gymnastics instructor who picked up exhibition work on the side. She had the kind of control that made difficult passes look routine. People described her as a perfectionist about presentations. She wasn't reckless. She was careful in a way that came from repetition and discipline, the kind that builds trust in your own timing. Before her segment, she stepped onto the floor for a brief walkthrough. It was methodical, checking the mat alignment, the grip of the surface, the spacing of her run. She paced out her steps, adjusted by inches, then reset, visualizing the sequence in her head. Everything below her was exactly where it needed to be. The showcase started. Maddie's segment came midway through the program. The hall had grown warmer, the air heavier. The fans continued to run, their constant hum blending into the background noise. A few spectators near the front glanced up at the wobbling fan, briefly pointing it out to each other before turning their attention back to the floor. Honestly, the part that is hard for me to understand is that people noticed it, but no one reacted, and that small moment of hesitation ended up being part of what led to her fall. She opened clean, round off into back handspring, building speed across the floor. Her movement was precise, controlled, exactly as practiced. Witnesses in the front rows later said they heard a sharper metallic sound as she set for her final element. A few people glanced upward. Most didn't. The routine held their focus. It struck me later how that sound was the first sign, but in the moment, no one realized what it meant. The mounting bracket failed after prolonged vibration. One loosened bolt sheared, shifting stress onto the remaining fasteners, which failed in rapid succession. The bracket and attached hardware, several pounds of metal, dropped straight onto the lane, directly into her takeoff zone. She was already committed. She launched into a high vertical salto. On descent, her foot struck the fallen hardware instead of the mat. The contact disrupted her base instantly. Her alignment broke mid-rotation. The twist didn't resolve. She came down in a torsional landing, her torso still turning as it descended, force loading across her shoulder and the side of her neck instead of her legs. Her head snapped sharply to the side. The impact caused a high cervical fracture dislocation, severing the spinal cord, fatal on impact. The music cut. The room shifted from noise to confusion in seconds. Staff rushed in. The showcase stopped immediately. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but the injury left no possibility for intervention. The fan was pulled down that night. The bracket failure was confirmed. Maintenance records showed it had been flagged 5 days earlier and left active. Photos taken afterward placed the debris directly within the landing path. The investigation pointed to a failure that wasn't sudden and wasn't unpredictable. The facility was found responsible for keeping a known hazard in operation, a fan that had already been flagged, documented, and left unrepaired above an active performance area. What stands out here is how Maddie did everything right: her preparation, her control, almost perfect execution. But one overlooked repair order turned it into a tragedy, a reminder that negligence can be just as lethal as recklessness. It was March 7th, 2017. Portland, Oregon in early March is the kind of gray that just doesn't quit. Overcast for weeks straight. Damp cold that gets into the walls of older houses and stays there. The East Side neighborhoods are packed with craftsman bungalows full of working professionals who take their morning routines seriously. Dave Rick was 43. Project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm, the kind of guy who ran his life on a tight schedule. He worked out 3 times a week, watched what he ate, and made a smoothie every single morning. Same ingredients, same order, same wide-mouth glass jar blender he'd had for years. At some point in the weeks before March 7th, a hairline crack had developed along the base of that jar. Not something you'd catch unless you were holding it up to direct light and specifically looking for it. That morning, the vibration of the blade under load finished what the crack had started. A small section of the base fractured inward during blending. The contents absorbed it. Thick smoothie, frozen fruit, no visual separation, and he drank it fast before heading out, rinsed the jar, and left for work. The missing section at the base wasn't something he would have noticed on a quick rinse. The thing about someone like Dave is that he wasn't the type to slow down over something minor. He tracked his nutrition, stuck to his workout schedule, and ran his days on a tight enough routine that small disruptions just got absorbed and moved past. A vague sense that something was slightly off on a cold morning. That's not the kind of thing a person like that stops to examine. Nothing about leaving for work that day felt like it needed a second look. By the time he was halfway through his commute, he'd noticed a faint scratching sensation in his throat that he put down to the cold air. He kept clearing his throat on and off through the morning, the kind of thing you do without really thinking about it. By that evening, the discomfort had shifted into a dull, persistent ache behind his sternum that got worse when he swallowed. He took ibuprofen, went to bed early, figured he was coming down with something. By March 9th, the pain had gotten bad enough that he called in sick. He was barely eating, drinking carefully. He had no idea what had actually happened 2 days before. What was going on inside him was a slow esophageal perforation. The fragment had lodged in the lower esophageal wall and was working through the tissue with every swallow. The lower esophagus sits just above the diaphragm, and once the wall gives way there, bacteria don't have far to travel. The mediastinum, the chest cavity between the lungs, becomes contaminated almost immediately, and from there the infection can track downward through the diaphragm into the peritoneal cavity surrounding the abdominal organs. It doesn't take long. By March 10th, Dave had a fever of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. His abdomen had become rigid and tender, and the pain had gotten bad enough that he could barely sit upright. A friend who stopped by that evening found him on the couch and called for help. Imaging confirmed esophageal perforation and extensive contamination throughout the mediastinal and peritoneal space. A glass fragment, approximately 9 millimeters in length, was identified at the perforation site in the lower esophageal wall. The peritonitis was already advanced, widespread bacterial contamination with sepsis taking hold. Surgical intervention was attempted, but his condition kept declining through the following day. Septic shock developed on March 11th. Dave died on March 12th, 5 days after that morning smoothie. The fragment recovered was consistent with the blender jar material. The jar had a propagated fracture along the base with a section missing that matched the recovered fragment exactly. Cause of death was confirmed as septic shock, secondary to esophageal perforation and peritonitis. Every symptom in those first 2 days had pointed to something completely ordinary, nothing that would make a person stop and reconsider their morning routine. The manner of death was recorded as accidental. At first, the sedan looked like it had simply been left behind, another stalled vehicle abandoned overnight in worsening winter conditions. But when one of the workers approached the driver's side window, he noticed something that didn't fit the scene. Timur Sadikov was 23 and worked construction jobs around Bishkek. Ayjan Kudayberdieva, similarly aged and 4 months pregnant, helped her aunt at a local market stall. They had been evicted from a shared rented room weeks earlier and planned to move to her parents' home in the Naren region for lower costs and support. To fund the trip, they sold most of what remained, including their phones, to cover fuel and food. The vehicle was an aging compact sedan with a worn battery system and heating that worked inconsistently. They left before a forecasted cold front, calculating an early start would get them across the pass before conditions worsened. That logic is not reckless. It's the reasoning of people with limited options making the best call available. Fuel was budgeted for normal conditions, not for what altitude does to an older engine in winter. The increased draw, mechanical strain, and miles added by a partial road closure that erased every estimate they'd worked out. By mid-afternoon of November 3rd, 2017, light snow had become wind-driven sheets crossing the road at ground level in Naren Province, Kyrgyzstan. Visibility dropped in waves. Timur slowed repeatedly on the ascent, reading the road by the silhouettes of roadside poles appearing and vanishing in the gusts. The engine labored under the grade. No villages lay ahead for many miles. Turning around on a mountain pass in a developing whiteout was not a real option. The dash cam footage recovered from the vehicle shows road markings disappearing entirely within minutes. Pole silhouettes briefly appear, then vanish. Timur slows to nearly a stop. Ayjan is visible in the passenger seat, rubbing her hands together, pressing closer to the heater vent. Wind noise overtakes the audio until it becomes increasingly wind-dominated before cutting out due to power instability and moisture buildup affecting the unit, and the recording degrades into fragments. The dashcam's power supply likely destabilizes under voltage drop and cold stress, and I didn't expect that kind of technical failure to feel as abrupt as it does when you watch it happen in real time. The engine gradually loses power with a rough idle before stalling completely without recovery. Dashboard lights dim and partially stabilize before weakening further. The vehicle drifts slightly right, barely a foot, off the compacted road surface into deeper accumulation. Forward movement ends. The engine stalls. What follows was reconstructed by investigators and plays out over several hours. Timur removes his outer jacket and lays it over Ayjan, who grows progressively still. They use paper packaging and fabric scraps as insulation. No open flame. Ayjan rests her hand over her abdomen at intervals. Timur checks outside conditions several times, each return slower. Breath condensation coats the windshield interior. Frost traces along the door seams. I keep returning to the frame of him placing his jacket over her. The final recoverable segment shows them seated together, Timur's arm around Ayjan, both largely motionless. The cabin light dims. Recording ends. No distress call was made. Both phones had been sold before the trip. A road maintenance crew discovered the vehicle the following morning during a post-storm sweep, 14 hours after the dashcam's last recording. Emergency services reached the scene within 2 hours of that crew's notification. The medical examiner determined both deaths resulted from hypothermia, core temperature loss sufficient to cause cardiovascular failure, preceded by progressive cognitive and motor impairment. Ayjan's examination confirmed the pregnancy at approximately 17 weeks. What I keep thinking is that their fuel estimate was probably correct. For a different day, a different vehicle, an unobstructed road. There was no obvious error. The cold front moved faster than forecast. The margin they'd counted on disappeared quietly, and the pass offered nothing to fill it. It was March 6, 2015. New York City, one of the busiest subway systems in the world, and on a Friday evening, it shows. The platform was the kind of crowded where you're standing close enough to feel the person next to you shift their weight. Rush hour was winding down, but not gone. There were still enough people packed onto that platform that nobody was paying much attention to anyone else. Everyone in their own world, earbuds in, eyes on their phones, just waiting for the train. Talia Whitmore was 22. She was a junior at a city university studying communications, and she'd just wrapped up an evening lecture that ran a little long. She was heading home, nothing unusual about it. She took this route all the time. She had her backpack on, earbuds in, phone in her hand. She was standing toward the middle of the platform, maybe 2 feet from the edge, waiting like everyone else. What she couldn't see was that 4 guys had followed her down those stairs and were already closing in. If you were online around this time, you probably heard of the knockout game, and if you hadn't, it's exactly what it sounds like, and somehow even worse. It was a trend that had been spreading across a handful of cities since around 2013. The idea was simple and genuinely awful. Pick a random stranger, usually someone alone, usually someone smaller, hit them as hard as you can from behind without warning, and film the reaction. That's it. That was the whole thing. And people were doing it for Vine, for laughs, for whatever validation comes from putting something like that online. By early 2015, it had already put people in the hospital. To the people doing it, that was apparently still funny. These 4 guys, who were all in their early 20s, all from the same neighborhood, had done this before. Not here, not on a subway platform, but they'd filmed versions of it elsewhere. That night, they'd been riding the subway looking for a target, and Talia caught their attention at the top of the stairs. They followed her down, spread out casually so they didn't look like a group, and one of them positioned himself directly behind her. The others had their phones out, angled to look like they were just scrolling. The train wasn't in the station yet. I genuinely don't think a single one of them understood what was below that platform. The designated hitter closed the gap and delivered a single punch to the back of Talia's head. Full force, no hesitation. And here's the thing about a blindside strike to the back of the skull. There's no bracing, no tensing, no preparation. Your body just goes. Talia pitched forward immediately. Her phone left her hand and she went off the platform edge. The drop to the tracks is about 4 feet. The platform erupted. People were screaming, backing away from the edge, some frozen completely. The 4 guys scattered in different directions within seconds. But here's what they didn't account for. At least 3 other people on that platform had their phones out, and 2 of them were already pointing in that direction when it happened. The whole thing was captured from multiple angles. The train came in about 40 seconds later. The operator hit the emergency brake the moment he saw people crowding the edge and screaming, but a subway train moving at speed doesn't stop on a dime. It came to a full stop well past where Talia had fallen. Transit workers reached the tracks within minutes. There was nothing to do. Talia Whitmore was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as electrocution resulting in cardiac arrest. Her right arm and shoulder had made direct contact with the third rail when she landed, and at 625 volts DC, cardiac arrest was near immediate. Secondary blunt force trauma from the fall and subsequent train impact were noted as contributing factors. The examiner noted she was likely unconscious within seconds of hitting the tracks. The 4 were identified within 72 hours. Witness descriptions, platform surveillance footage, and videos recovered from their own phones, one of which had partially uploaded to Vine before he even left the station, made identification straightforward. All 4 were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The partial Vine upload was time-stamped and matched transit logs exactly, placing them on that platform at that exact moment. They were later convicted, with the court citing the coordinated assault and resulting fall onto the tracks as the direct cause of death, and each received multi-year prison sentences. Talia's backpack was recovered on the tracks. Her phone was found on the platform where it had landed when she fell. Her last message had been sent 11 minutes before she reached that station, a text to her roommate saying she was on her way home. It was March 11, 2018, at a state competition arena in Florida. A regional collegiate meet mid-season, the kind of event that doesn't make national headlines but matters enormously to the athletes involved. The arena was packed with parents, scouts, and students who'd driven in from nearby campuses. The lights were bright, the floor was clean, and everything about the building looked exactly the way it was supposed to. The danger wasn't in the building. It wasn't flagged in any report. No loose bolts, no slick surfaces, no warning signs. Every piece of equipment had passed inspection that morning. Dallas Croft was 20 years old, a collegiate gymnast in her sophomore year, training under a program that ran a tight rotation. Her teammates described her as the quiet one who never complained, the kind of athlete who'd stay after practice to drill the same dismount 50 times without being asked. What struck me about her was not just the skill, but the attitude. There was a kind of quiet determination about her, the kind you only notice when someone shows up every day without needing applause. 2 days before the meet, during a routine practice, Dallas had clipped her head on the beam during a dismount transition. It wasn't a dramatic fall. She'd landed, walked it off, and finished the session. But teammates noticed she was slower than usual the next morning. Her timing on a release move was off by a beat. She bumped into a chair walking out of the locker room and laughed it off. She didn't tell the medical staff. She didn't tell her coach. She knew what would happen if she did. A mandatory hold, a missed competition, and the athlete behind her stepping into her spot. 2 days weren't enough time to know if she'd get it back. Something about this one really bothers me. Hide it, push through, hope it clears up. That logic is wrong, but it isn't crazy. The day of the meet, she warmed up with the team. A couple of teammates noticed her coordination still looked off. Small things, the way she set her hands on the bar, the half-second longer than usual to find her mark. Nobody escalated it. She got cleared by the team physician in a standard pre-competition check that didn't include a concussion screening. Her event was the uneven bars. She mounted cleanly. The opening sequence went through at slightly reduced speed, but it was controlled. She made it through the first 2 transitions without obvious trouble. Then came the release move, the part of the routine that demands the brain and body to fire in sync, no margin for delay. She let go of the high bar and rotated. Her reaction timing lagged. Her arms extended toward the bar a fraction of a second too late. Her lead hand made partial contact. Her trailing hand missed completely. That brief one-handed grab was enough to redirect her momentum forward instead of stopping the rotation cleanly. She came off the bar moving the wrong direction, with her body still rotating. On the way down, her hip clipped the lower bar, and that contact accelerated the spin. She landed upper back first across the mat. The impact forced her spine into rapid flexion, and her head whipped forward in a secondary motion. Not the first thing to hit the mat, but the part of her body that absorbed the worst of the force on the rebound. Medical staff were on the floor within seconds. She was conscious but disoriented. They stabilized her immediately and moved her out of the arena. The meet was paused. The investigation didn't focus on the equipment at all. The bars and mat passed inspection. What investigators focused on was Dallas herself, specifically the head impact she'd sustained 2 days earlier and never reported. Teammates gave statements describing the slowed coordination. Practice video from the day of the original impact was reviewed. The medical timeline was reconstructed. The official finding identified a prior unreported concussion as the primary contributing factor, with impaired reaction timing leading directly to the missed grip on the release move. If I'm being honest, the part that's hardest to sit with isn't the fall. It's the 2 days before it. 2 full days where someone could have caught this, and nobody did unless she raised her hand. The program updated its protocol to require independent concussion screening before any competition, regardless of whether an athlete reported symptoms. It was October 11, 2015. Caldwell, Ohio is deep Appalachian country. Rolling hills, narrow roads, houses far enough apart that nobody really notices what's going on at the neighbor's place. Mid-October out there means frost in the hollows, gray skies that don't lift, and older homes that run damp in their lower levels because the foundations were never properly sealed. Just part of living there. Rafe Munden was 53. He'd lived alone in the same house outside Caldwell for over 2 decades, inherited it from his parents, and had no real plans to go anywhere else. He worked part-time as an equipment mechanic for a local farming operation. Practical, self-sufficient, the kind of man who fixed things himself and spent as little as necessary. He kept a large stock of dry goods in his basement: cornmeal, flour, dried beans, oats, bulk purchases he rotated through slowly, the way a lot of people in that part of Ohio do. The basement had a moisture problem he'd been meaning to deal with for years, and neighbors had mentioned seeing rats around the property the previous spring. He'd set a few traps and figured that was the end of it. He lived alone, saw his co-workers a few days a week, and had no immediate family nearby. A damp basement full of bulk dry goods isn't unusual in that part of Ohio. It's practical. It's how a lot of households in rural areas manage food storage, and it works fine the vast majority of the time. The moisture problem had been there for years without consequence. The rat traps had seemed like enough. There was no reason from where Rafe was standing to treat any of it as urgent. Rafe used cornmeal from a basement bag sometime during the week of October 11th. The exact date isn't certain. When investigators examined that bag later, they found gnaw marks along the lower seam and dried rat droppings inside the folds of the outer packaging. Nothing about the cornmeal itself would have looked or smelled any different, which makes me wonder how many people are storing food the exact same way right now without thinking twice about it. By October 16th, his coworker noticed he looked off, pale, headaches, muscle aches. Rafe chalked it up to a cold and left it at that. By October 18th, he hadn't shown up for 2 days and wasn't answering. His coworker drove out and found him inside, conscious but in genuinely bad shape, jaundiced, confused, and with bruising spreading across his abdomen and sides that he couldn't explain. And that bruising is worth paying attention to. It wasn't from any impact. Leptospira, in its severe form, breaks down blood vessel walls throughout the body, causing them to leak into surrounding tissue, into the abdominal cavity, into the lungs. He'd been hemorrhaging internally across multiple sites for days and had no idea. I think most people picture internal bleeding as something you'd feel immediately. This case is a pretty good argument against that. His liver was in acute failure, kidney function had already dropped critically, and internal bleeding was confirmed in multiple locations. His kidneys shut down completely on October 19th. The following day, pulmonary hemorrhage developed, bleeding directly into the lung tissue, and his breathing deteriorated fast. He died on October 20th, 9 days after the estimated exposure. Post-mortem confirmed Leptospira interrogans, consistent with Weil's disease. The cornmeal bag tested positive for Leptospira contamination. Rat activity in that basement was far more extensive than a few traps would have touched. Compromised packaging on multiple food items, dried urine soaked into the shelving, long-term infestation throughout. The manner of death was recorded as accidental. Now what happens when the people who always run toward the danger to help others are finally met with a wave that will not let them go? An incident on September 28, 2018 has the answer just for that. Darius Sirigar was 42 and worked as a junior logistics coordinator for a small regional shipping company. His wife Melina, 41, volunteered full-time with a community health organization, distributing supplies and coordinating care across low-income neighborhoods. People who knew them described them the same way, consistently, steady, reliable, the kind who showed up before being asked. Colleagues said Darius knew the coastal neighborhoods better than most dispatchers. Melina had spent years building trust in communities that didn't easily extend it. It's saddening to know that their reputation was not incidental to what happened next. Earlier that afternoon, a 7.5 magnitude earthquake had shaken the region of Palu in Indonesia. When the initial tremors passed, most residents moved inland. Darius and Melina stayed. Witnesses later told recovery teams the couple had been distributing bottled water in a low-lying coastal neighborhood and remained behind to help two elderly residents, a man and a woman, both unable to move quickly, through the narrow alleyways toward higher ground. I think about the specific weight of that choice a lot. They had done this before in smaller emergencies, and it had always worked out. That history is probably why they didn't leave. The sea had already begun withdrawing. Witnesses on the flat rooftop of a two-story building roughly 80 feet away described it as an abnormal recession. The bay pulling back, exposing wet sand and stranded debris where open water had been minutes earlier. People on the roof were calling out. The alley below held standing water from earlier flooding, ankle-deep and moving. The first surge arrived as a lateral push of gray-brown water that swept vehicles across the main road within seconds. Witnesses later described it less as a single wave and more as a sudden, forceful surge that did not fully recede. Water in the alley jumped to waist height almost immediately. Witnesses on the roof reported the couple still moving, still upright. Darius with his arm under the older man's shoulder. The second surge was not clearly separated from the first in all accounts, but was described as a renewed and stronger inflow that overwhelmed remaining structures along the corridor. Witnesses described the water rising to chest height in seconds, not minutes. A section of exterior wall from an adjacent structure folded into the alley corridor. The current was no longer clear. Dark, heavy, carrying roofing fragments, timber, a tire. Witnesses reported seeing the couple reach a metal gate near the alley's end. They held the uprights. The gate was anchored to a cinder block wall. One witness said the wall held for a moment before the base gave way. The gate went with it. I've read a lot of survivor accounts from Palu. The detail that stays with me is how accounts vary, but consistently place both of them still facing toward the elderly residents when the structure failed. Recovery teams did not reach the corridor until well into the following day, after conditions allowed limited foot access through debris-choked streets. The coroner summary listed cause of death for both individuals as blunt force trauma consistent with high-velocity debris impact and drowning. Standard forensic language noted crush injuries and asphyxiation related to floodwaters and structural collapse. Their bodies were found within several feet of each other, near a collapsed perimeter wall, in the same corridor where witnesses last saw them. The two elderly residents they had been guiding were not recovered in the immediate vicinity. I don't think there's a clean lesson embedded in this one. Some people have shown up to enough emergencies that when the last one arrives, they don't register it as different from the rest. Darius and Melina Sirigar were among 4,340 confirmed dead in Palu. They were described by people who knew them as steady people who always showed up when things went wrong. On September 28, 2018, they did exactly that. And the city they spent years quietly serving was the last thing they ever tried to hold together. It was September 23, 2016, Knoxville, Tennessee, a Friday night, end of September, that sweet spot in the semester where midterms haven't hit yet and everyone's still in the mood to celebrate nothing in particular. Rental property 3 blocks off campus, fits maybe 30 people comfortably, had about 50 in it that night. Music loud, kitchen crowded, people spilling out onto the back porch. Brody Weston was 21. Junior year, engineering major, worked hard during the week and let loose on weekends. Not a heavy drinker, someone who knew his limits and stuck to them. He'd been at the party about an hour when someone he barely knew showed up at the front door with an unmarked plastic jug. Peripheral figure, someone's roommate's friend, the kind of person who shows up without really being invited, walked in carrying the jug like a trophy, telling anyone who'd listen it was homemade moonshine, the real stuff. At a college party in Tennessee, that's not a red flag on its own. What made this different was how he was selling it. Daring people to drink, playing up the burn, framing hesitation as weakness. He'd sampled it before bringing it and knew it tasted off. Told people that was just how strong it was. What he never mentioned was that he'd never properly learned how to run a still. Brody took 2 long pulls. It burned going down, really burned. But the guy next to him said that meant it was working. A few others drank from it too, smaller amounts, cautious sips. The guy with the jug didn't drink any more himself after that. He spent the rest of the night watching other people drink it. That's the moment I would have been like, wait, why'd he stop? In hindsight, that was kind of hard to ignore. About 90 minutes later, Brody started complaining of a headache. Bad one came on fast. His friends figured he was drunk, told him to drink some water. He felt nauseous not long after, came back from the bathroom looking pale, still talking, still joking about it a little. Around midnight, he mentioned his vision felt off, blurry, hard to focus. Someone told him he'd had too much. He went to lie down around 12:30. Nobody checked on him for a while. The party kept going. A friend found him just after 2 a.m., conscious but barely, confused, not tracking, breathing shallow, skin grayish and soaked through his shirt. That's when someone finally called for help. Here's what was actually in that jug. Homemade distillation without proper equipment produces methanol alongside the ethanol you actually want, and the two are completely indistinguishable by taste or smell. No warning, no way to know. Methanol itself isn't the primary danger. The problem is what the body converts it into: formaldehyde, then formic acid. The fact that it goes for your eyes first makes this so much more horrifying than I expected. The process takes hours, meaning by the time someone feels seriously sick, the damage has been underway for a long time. Attending staff suspected toxic alcohol ingestion almost immediately. The headache, the vision disturbance, the timeline all pointed there. Treatment involves blocking the metabolic conversion, but the damage already done couldn't be reversed. Liver and kidney values were critically abnormal within hours. A seizure during treatment placed serious stress on his heart. Brody Weston was declared brain dead approximately 31 hours after ingestion. He was 21 years old. Toxicology confirmed methanol concentration well above the lethal threshold. Cause of death was methanol poisoning, formic acid accumulation, metabolic acidosis, multi-organ failure, brain death. 2 long pulls versus a cautious sip. That's the entire margin between Brody and everyone else who drank from that jug and survived. The man with the jug was identified through party photos and witness accounts. Methanol content confirmed consistent with an improperly run still. Charged with criminally negligent homicide and reckless endangerment. Convicted on both counts, sentenced to 5 years. Served 3.5. It was August 9th, 2017, at an indoor arena on the edge of a small Nevada city. A regional invitational midsummer with attendance that filled maybe 2/3 of the seats. The arena was older than it looked, built in the 80s, retrofitted twice, and running on a power grid with a documented history of voltage drops during peak load months. The arena staff knew about the issue. Brief flickers had happened earlier that day. A few competitors mentioned it during warm-ups. The lighting would dim for a fraction of a second and then come back. Backup lighting existed, but it required manual activation by an operator in the booth. It wasn't automatic. Tenzin Glynn was 23, an experienced gymnast in the open class division. He'd been on the floor circuit for 6 years, coaching weekends at a small private studio. People who'd worked with him described him as fast, fearless, and stubborn about pacing. His tumbling passes were aggressive, full speed in, full commitment through the rotation, no hedging on the takeoff. He'd noticed the flickers earlier. Some athletes adjusted routines, scaling back difficulty to give themselves margin if something went wrong mid-element. Tenzin chose not to. His reasoning was simple. Cutting speed meant cutting amplitude. Cutting amplitude meant cutting his score. A flicker lasting less than a second wasn't going to change a routine he'd done 100 times. If you'd done it clean 100 times and the only warning was a half-second flicker, would you change anything? I'm not sure I would. That's what makes this one uncomfortable. His turn came up. He stepped onto the floor, set his line, and started his run. He accelerated through the opening pass, fast, committed, no hesitation. The round-off and back handspring chain went clean. He set up for his primary flipping element, a high double rotation that needed precise visual tracking on the way down. He launched. At the apex of his rotation, the lights dimmed. Not off, just dim. The contrast dropped sharply. For a fraction of a second, the floor below went from clearly defined to flat and gray. That fraction of a second was enough. Witnesses said they saw him hesitate mid-air. A tiny adjustment when his eyes couldn't find a reference point fast enough. The hesitation altered his rotation timing. He drifted slightly off the center line. His body kept rotating, but now over the wrong part of the floor. He came down near the edge of the mat. One foot landed on padded surface, the other partially off on the harder floor. The uneven base created lateral instability as his legs absorbed the load. His knee gave, and his body folded into a sideways fall. His hip and shoulder hit first. His head followed. His torso compressed sharply as he landed twisted, the force driving inward through his rib cage and upper abdomen before he flattened out on the mat. The lights had come back up by the time he stopped moving. Medical staff reached him within seconds. He was conscious. He tried to speak, managed only a few words, and tried to push himself up. It didn't work. His breathing had already become shallow, uneven. He stayed alert long enough to respond when they called his name, long enough to try one deeper breath that never came. On the way out, he was still conscious. His hand moved once, gripping the side rail, then less, then not at all. He was transported under critical care and died later in the hospital after a brief period where intervention stabilized him but couldn't reverse what had already happened internally. The investigation pulled the building's electrical logs. The voltage drop was confirmed and matched to the moment of his landing. The backup lighting system was found functional but inadequate. The medical examiner's report was precise. The cause of death was internal hemorrhage from traumatic rupture of major blood vessels in the thoracic cavity, consistent with high-force compressive impact during an off-axis landing. I've watched the witness clips of this one more times than I should have. Half a second. That's all it took. And I still can't decide if I'd call this bad luck or a building quietly daring someone to be the one in the air when it happened. The arena suspended all events pending an electrical overhaul. Backup lighting requirements were revised to require automatic activation on any voltage variance. It was August 19, 2017. The Gulf Coast of Louisiana in mid-August is brutal in a way that's hard to overstate. Temperatures pushing past 93 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. Humidity so thick it feels physical. The kind of heat where standing outside for an hour leaves you completely drained. Small coastal towns along that stretch have been running seafood festivals every summer for decades, and they draw a steady crowd, locals mostly, people who've been going to these things their whole lives. Corey Thassel was 61. He'd spent most of his working life as a freight logistics coordinator out of Baton Rouge. Desk job, steady routine, nothing that would make you look twice. By his own measure, he was in reasonable shape for his age. He drank socially, had done so consistently for years, but had never been told anything was wrong and hadn't felt the need to see a doctor in a while. That weekend, he drove out to the festival with 2 co-workers. Just a casual end-of-summer outing, a few hours outside, some food. He ordered 2 dozen raw oysters from a vendor near the waterfront, ate them over about an hour, had a couple of beers alongside. He'd eaten raw oysters at events like this before and never had a problem. So what exactly was there to worry about? Vendors at events like that, one, operate under state inspection, pull from licensed suppliers, and turn over product fast enough that sitting inventory isn't the concern it might be elsewhere. The waterfront location, the crowd, the casual, late summer atmosphere, it was exactly the kind of setting where oysters make sense. People order them at events like this all the time. It's the kind of setup that, by every reasonable measure, you'd feel fine eating from. By that evening, roughly 6 hours after eating, Corey told one of his co-workers he felt nauseated and feverish. They figured it was the heat. Honestly, a reasonable assumption given the conditions that day, and he drove himself home. By midnight, his fever had climbed to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and he was vomiting repeatedly. He didn't call for help, assumed it was food poisoning, and expected to feel better by morning. By August 20th, his daughter stopped by to drop something off and found him barely conscious on his bathroom floor. What had been happening inside him overnight is where this case gets genuinely hard to sit with. The bacteria had already crossed from his gut into his bloodstream and was moving through his body in a way it wouldn't in most people. The reason for that only came out later. By the time he was being assessed, the first signs of necrotizing fasciitis were already visible along his left thigh and lower abdomen. I think people hear that term and don't fully picture what it means. The skin on the surface can look relatively normal while the tissue underneath is already dead, and the destruction spreads along the connective layers between muscle and skin faster than it can be surgically removed. Over the next 18 hours, the affected area expanded from his left thigh across his abdomen and toward his chest wall, despite repeated surgical intervention. His kidneys went first, then his liver, then his cardiovascular system stopped holding up altogether. Corey died on August 21st, approximately 44 hours after eating those oysters. He never regained full consciousness after being found. Post-mortem confirmed Vibrio vulnificus septicemia as the primary cause of death. Tissue cultures from the necrotic areas confirmed the same organism throughout. Liver examination revealed significant fibrosis consistent with years of undiagnosed alcohol-related liver disease, a condition he had no knowledge of and no symptoms pointing toward. Water temperature logs from the harvest area confirmed Gulf temperatures of 86 degrees Fahrenheit at the time of collection, well within the range that supports bacterial proliferation in shellfish. No other festival attendees reported similar illness. Without that underlying liver condition, the infection almost certainly wouldn't have progressed beyond severe gastroenteritis. The investigation found no grounds for anything other than an accidental ruling. This trip to the Canadian Rockies was supposed to be another careful step forward, not the kind of night anyone would remember for the wrong reasons. Ethan and Naya had no indication it was their last night. Ethan, 28, was a freelance outdoor photographer, while Nia, 29, worked in environmental research administration for a government agency and was the logistician of the two. Permits, approach routes, contingencies. They had been working toward a high-altitude expedition. Everest had come up in journals and close conversations, discussed practically. This trip was part of that progression. It was October 14th, 2016, and they had arrived later than planned. A gear stop delayed the drive. The camping area fell within a zone with general informational signage noting freeze-thaw instability on nearby cliff formations, with warnings posted at the trailhead kiosk. The area remained open. Ethan had identified the site via satellite imagery weeks earlier. It placed them roughly 240 feet from the cliff base, close enough for the wide-angle shot he had planned for first light. Photos of the intended composition were recovered on his memory card. I think the decision makes sense when you understand what they were working toward. The site was legal. The research was real. By midnight, the valley was quiet. A solo camper had settled roughly 300 feet to the northeast. A half-moon cast flat light across the upper ridge. The cliff above rose approximately 200 feet of fractured granite, its upper sections marked by horizontal stress lines, the result of weeks cycling above and below freezing. None of that was visible from approximately 240 feet below in the dark. The posted warnings had been accurate. What they could not provide was a date. At approximately 2:40 a.m., the solo camper woke to a single deep crack. Not a tree, but something structural, below the range of ordinary sound. He activated his headlamp, a helmet camera he had left on a time-lapse setting. recovered in partially corrupted and heavily overexposed segments, shows indistinct grain and shifting brightness along the upper ridgeline consistent with dust and debris movement forming within seconds. Then the face came down. A section of cliff measuring an estimated 40 feet across sheared outward and broke apart in freefall. The largest fragments were the size of compact cars. They struck the slope above the tree line first, driving secondary material outward in multiple directions. 2 mature spruce trees at the cliff base were not knocked over. They were compressed. The tent was within that zone. The first phase lasted approximately 8 seconds. The solo camper did not move during the initial fall. He told investigators the sound that followed resembled continuous rolling thunder, directional, sustained, coming downhill in waves. Debris field analysis later confirmed the event unfolded in at least 3 sequential phases with brief pauses between major bursts. He activated his emergency beacon and moved to higher ground. Rangers received the signal within minutes but could not safely approach until dawn due to continued rock instability along the access route. They reached the site at approximately 6:10 a.m., roughly 3.5 hours after the event. Ethan and Nia were found beneath primary debris. Neither had exited the tent. The coroner's report noted that both individuals sustained unsurvivable crush injuries from sudden high-mass impact, thoracic compression, cranial fractures, and bilateral skeletal trauma to the lower body. Death in both cases was determined to have been instantaneous. No equipment failure was identified. The incident was logged in internal park records and received limited regional coverage. The park's internal review led to revised proximity guidelines for dispersed camping near formations rated for instability. I think those guidelines were right. They were also years overdue. However, I believe there is no clean place to put blame here. The warning existed. The site was open. A section of cliff that had been fracturing for weeks chose that temperature and that hour. They never did get to find out if they were ready. It was April 8th, year 2017 in Portland, Oregon, one of those perfect early spring mornings where the air is still cold enough to see your breath, but the sun is already out and the roads are dry. The kind of morning that makes you want to be outside. A small cycling group had been meeting on Saturday mornings for about 2 years. 6 people, casual, recreational. Darcy Wren, 34 years old, a graphic designer who worked from home, had been part of this riding group since almost the beginning and used the weekend rides as the one thing that reliably cleared her head. She was a solid rider, not competitive, just consistent. She had a good bike, kept it maintained, knew what she was doing on it. One of the guys in the group, a 36-year-old named Garrett Finch, had a reputation for pulling pranks. Nothing malicious, just the kind of guy who thought it was funny to mess with people in small ways. The night before the Saturday ride, he'd gone to the open carport attached to the house where the group typically met before rides and loosened the seat post bolt on Darcy's bike. Just enough that the seat would feel slightly unstable under body weight, but not enough that anything would look wrong at a glance. His plan was simple. She'd sit down, feel the wobble, everyone would laugh, she'd tighten it up, they'd move on. 30 seconds of mild embarrassment. That was genuinely the whole plan in his head. Darcy didn't notice it standing still. She did a quick visual check the way she always did before clipping in, didn't catch it, and the group set off just after 7 a.m. The route they always took had a long downhill stretch about 20 minutes in, a residential road that dropped steadily over about half a mile. Smooth asphalt, nothing technical about it. They'd all ridden it dozens of times. Darcy had ridden it dozens of times. About 15 minutes into the ride, Darcy noticed the seat felt slightly off. Not dramatically wrong, just not quite right. She shifted her weight, adjusted her position, figured it was just how she'd clipped in. She didn't want to hold the group up, so she kept going. And somewhere across town, he had no idea what his little prank was about to turn into. They hit the top of the downhill stretch and started descending. Darcy was sitting third in the group, moving at around 25 miles per hour, which for that road on that morning was completely normal. Midway down the hill, the seat post gave way. The bolt had worked itself fully loose under the repeated pressure and movement of pedaling, and the seat dropped and twisted sideways. When your seat goes out from under you at speed on a bike, you lose your center of gravity instantly. There's no recovering from it. Your weight shifts forward, your steering goes with it, and it happens faster than you can process. Darcy's front wheel veered left. She went down hard on the asphalt, right side first, sliding across the road surface before coming to a stop against the curb. The group was on her within seconds. She was conscious, confused, asking what happened, trying to sit up. She was talking. She seemed okay. Responders arrived about 8 minutes later, and she was rushed to a trauma facility immediately. She lost consciousness in transit. She never woke up. Darcy Wren died 11 hours later. The cause of death was severe traumatic brain injury, acute subdural hematoma resulting from the head impact with the curb edge during the slide. The helmet had absorbed the initial impact from the fall itself, but the secondary strike against the raised concrete curb edge was what did the damage. The bike was examined as part of the investigation. The seat post bolt was confirmed as deliberately loosened. Thread wear pattern inconsistent with normal use, manually backed out. Garrett came forward 2 days later and admitted to it. Text messages from the night before referencing the prank were entered as primary evidence alongside the bike report and witness accounts from the other 4 group members. Criminally negligent homicide in Oregon is a Class B felony. Garrett was convicted and sentenced to 6 years. He served 4. It was November 2, 2016, at a small training center tucked into a light industrial stretch of inland California. A converted warehouse with concrete floors under a layer of foam, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, equipment shared between an adult open class and a small competitive program. The facility ran on a tight budget. Spotters were assigned from within the program, usually senior athletes or coaches with general experience, not specialists. That worked fine for standard skills. It got thinner when athletes started progressing into elements that demanded a specific kind of catch. Rexton Swev was 21 years old, an advanced trainee working full-time in a customer service job he hated and pouring everything else into the gym. He'd transferred to this facility a year earlier to work on harder vault progressions. Teammates described him as ambitious in a way that didn't always match his actual mileage in the sport. He wanted to be further along than he was, and he made up the gap by adding difficulty faster than most coaches would have recommended. He'd been working on a new vault transition for about 3 weeks. The element involved a high rotation with a body line that flipped and twisted at the same time. The kind of maneuver where the spotter has to know exactly where the athlete's torso is going to be at the catch point. Timing isn't approximate on these. The spotter that afternoon was a senior athlete from the open class side, experienced in general spotting, but he hadn't worked this specific maneuver before. He'd stepped in for one prior attempt that ended in a near miss. His hands had reached the catch position a fraction late, and Rexton had landed the rotation himself by reflex. Most athletes would have flagged it, reset the progression, asked for a coach who'd worked the element before. Rexton went the other direction. He increased his entry speed and rotational height on the next attempts, treating the near miss as a one-off. His logic, based on what teammates said afterward, was that the spotter would adjust as he saw more reps. Slowing down meant losing 3 weeks of momentum. The session continued. Rexton hit the vault at full speed and launched into the maneuver with more rotation than his previous reps. The spotter, calibrated to a slower version of the skill, stepped in on the timing he'd seen before. He was late. His hands made partial contact with Rexton's torso instead of catching cleanly under it. The contact wasn't centered. It hit one side of the body harder than the other, and at the speed Rexton was rotating, that uneven contact introduced rotational torque across his body's axis, a twist on top of the flip he was already doing. His body line broke mid-air. Witnesses described a corkscrew descent, the rotation he'd planned for, plus an unplanned spiral on top. He tried to extend one arm to stabilize, but the twist had already taken his alignment past the point where a single arm could correct it. He landed with asymmetric loading across his shoulder and torso. His head contacted the mat last, after the rotational momentum had already carried the rest of his body through the impact. Training stopped immediately. Rexton was breathing but unresponsive when staff reached him. He was transported under critical care and did not recover. The investigation focused on the spotting assignment and the progression schedule. The vault, runway, and mat all passed inspection. What the report identified was a mismatch. An athlete progressing faster than the available spotting expertise could keep up with, and a near miss that should have triggered a stop. A near miss is supposed to mean something, a free lesson. I think Rexton got that lesson. He just decided it didn't apply to him yet. The facility revised its spotter qualification policy. Any advanced element now required a spotter with documented experience on that specific skill, and any near miss automatically triggered a 48-hour progression hold. It was September 4th, 2015. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in central Idaho is one of the largest roadless areas in the entire country. In early September, the trails thin out fast, temperatures drop into the low 40s degrees Fahrenheit after dark, and the nearest trailhead can sit 20 or more miles from the nearest paved road. Win Olson was 34. He worked as a land surveyor out of Missoula, Montana, spent most of his working hours outdoors reading terrain, moving through it. That kind of job builds a comfort level in the backcountry that's hard to explain to someone who doesn't have it. Solo trips weren't a big deal to him. No group, no guide, just him and a route he'd been thinking about for months. A 9-day loop through the Selway drainage, roughly 47 miles, a section of which he'd already done before. Among the food he packed were several jars of venison he'd home-canned himself the previous winter, something he'd done before without any problems. Before he left, he gave his older brother the route details and his return date, September 13th. That was it. One person knew where he was. That's not negligence. That's standard practice for experienced solo travelers. You leave a route, you leave a return date, and that's considered doing it right. The problem wasn't the plan. The problem was that by September 8th, the margin had already closed. Wynn made camp on the evening of September 6th, near a creek crossing at around 4,800 feet elevation. He heated one of the venison jars over his stove, ate. Nothing seemed off. By the afternoon of September 7th, his trail journal mentioned unusual fatigue and a dull headache. He chalked it up to elevation. That evening, the entries got more specific. Vision slightly off. Swallowing felt strange. He ate very little and made no connection to the food, which honestly makes sense. He'd made that venison himself, eaten it before. Nothing had ever happened. By the morning of September 8th, the paralysis had started moving through him in a way that couldn't be ignored. Botulinum toxin doesn't cause pain the way most people imagine. It just quietly cuts the line between the nervous system and the muscles. Jaw first, then the neck, then the arms. His journal entry that morning was noticeably different. Uneven handwriting, short, fragmented sentences. He wrote that his arms felt heavy and that he couldn't get his pack on. There's nothing after 9 a.m. That was the last entry he ever made. What happened after that can be reconstructed from the physical evidence and the known progression of untreated botulism. By midday, he likely couldn't walk. Sometime in the early afternoon, the paralysis would have reached his diaphragm, the muscle that drives breathing. And this is the part that gets me. Botulinum toxin doesn't affect cognition at all. His mind would have been completely clear the entire time. He knew exactly what was happening, and there was nothing he could do about it. Fully conscious, slowly losing the ability to breathe, alone in the middle of 1.3 million acres with no one within miles. His brother reached out to authorities on September 14th when Wynn didn't return to his truck. A search team found him on September 15th, approximately 2.3 miles from his last camp, off the main trail, partially sheltered against a large downed tree. His pack was beside him with 2 unopened venison jars still inside. The opened jar from September 6th was recovered at the campsite. His GPS recorded his last movement at 1:47 p.m. on September 8th. The medical examiner confirmed botulinum toxin type A as the cause of death. The recovered venison jar tested positive for Clostridium botulinum. No visible spoilage, no swelling, nothing on the outside of that jar that would have told him anything was wrong. Time of death was estimated between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. on September 8th. He had taken the last of the canning batch with him. Nobody else got sick. The case was ruled accidental. Sometimes the most dangerous decision is the one that looks responsible. Harold and Diane were not reckless people, and they were not the kind to ignore an evacuation notice or assume they knew better than emergency crews. If anything, they trusted systems too much: maps, posted signs, official routes, the idea that if a road was open, it was meant to be used. Harold Chavez was 68 and had spent 31 years as a floor supervisor at a manufacturing plant outside Fresno before retiring with Diane, his wife of 42 years. They had been full-timing in their RV for 3 years. Friends described them as deliberate travelers, people who called ahead, read posted notices, and rarely made unplanned turns. Their travel logs were color-coded. When the primary evacuation route was formally closed that morning of August 19, 2015, motorists mentioned seeing the RV pulled over. Harold had likely studied the road atlas he kept in the side pocket of the driver's door. The secondary fire road running south through the canyon in the inland ranges of Northern California was marked on the laminated county map as emergency access. But the physical signage along that stretch was aged, partially faded, and inconsistent with current fire use classification standards. A sign at the entrance confirmed that designation. To someone who had spent 3 decades making procedural decisions on a factory floor, that sign likely read as permission. That's how I read it too, honestly, and I understand exactly why he turned in. What the sign did not communicate, because no sign could, was that emergency access roads in active fire terrain are designed for vehicles moving toward a fire, not families moving away from one. The road was unpaved, narrow, and running directly along the base of a ridge that was already drawing the fire's convection column southward. The Chavezes had no radio scanner, no fire agency frequency, and no way to know that the burn had crossed the ridge above them within the previous 40 minutes. A lookout named Ricardo Chavez, stationed in an elevated fire watchtower roughly 2 miles northeast, was the last person to see the RV moving under its own power. He later told investigators he watched it enter the smoke corridor from his position and immediately reached for his radio. He described the visibility inside the canyon as already below 100 feet and dropping. Flame torching was visible on the upper ridge to the north. He reported the vehicle's position and direction to dispatch and continued watching until smoke obscured his sightline entirely. I keep thinking about what it must have been like to watch that and not be able to do anything, just standing there with a radio, waiting for someone to answer. The 911 call from Harold's cell phone was logged at 11:21 a.m. The audio recovered from dispatch reconstruction records and call logs lasted approximately 4 minutes and 18 seconds before the line went silent. Harold's voice was calm for the first 90 seconds and fragmented by the 3rd minute. Coughing is audible throughout. Diane's voice appears twice. Investigators noted that smoke had begun infiltrating the cabin through the ventilation system well before the vehicle stopped moving. Exterior wildfire monitoring footage from a canyon-facing unit installed on a U.S. Forest Service fire lookout tower camera system and nearby utility monitoring infrastructure showed the fire behavior shifting rapidly as spot fires driven by wind gusts and ember transport began collapsing the available escape corridor from multiple ignition points. The RV stopped moving at an indeterminate point between 11:22 and 11:26 a.m. The engine likely stalled shortly after intake air quality degraded beyond operational thresholds. The last audible sounds on the 911 reconstruction are nonverbal. By the time the corridor was accessible, the vehicle had been reduced to a partial frame. Recovery of Harold's and Diane's remains was conducted over 2 days. What I keep landing on is that Harold and Diane did not ignore the evacuation. They followed what looked like the correct procedure, with the information they had, in the time they had to act. The road failed them. The sign failed them. And honestly, so did the system that put that sign there without any mechanism to close it when it mattered.